If you even look at data nowadays, you're a dumbass. You should just know. Street smart people don't need data. We've just been around. You know?
That is so relatable to me. I can't even explain it. Well, the moon landings definitely happened because this, and the firmament, and they could get, and I'm just like, no, I don't know. Instinctually, it just doesn't register to me. It just feels like that is a lie.
But I suppose for someone who openly questions well-established scientific facts, such as the existence of dinosaurs, or whether the earth is round, or whether or not we landed on the moon, it should perhaps come as no surprise she has little regard for the rules of critical thinking and sound reasoning. Except, it does ultimately beg the question, if no institution is trustworthy, if certain science is not settled, if the rules of critical thinking can be selectively applied according to one's own agendas, upon what authority does Candace even stand to make truth statements? If facts are now defined by what she arbitrarily deems them to be on any given day, and can otherwise be distorted at will to support mistruths and propaganda, what exactly is there to help her audience ascertain what is true or false aside from Candace's own word? Or worse, her dreams and intuition, which her reporting so heavily relies on.
The other lie, and you already said you can't provide evidence, is that Tree of Logic was paid
I
by the
100% think that she's paid. There was no way. By the way, if I say that I think something is paid, that is at my discretion. I can say I cannot present to you a fact, and you can't present to me not a fact. Okay, we're both. I'm speculating, and you're saying
it's going to sound crazy coming from me, but I appreciate someone like Candace Owens to show me the hypocrisy on both sides, the nastiness, and how money and power rules over all.
Look at her face. Look at her stupid bitch face. You can literally see it in her eyes that she is a stupid bitch.
What I was loath to see before, that Candace is not on our team. She's not pursuing the future that we're pursuing. She's not appealing to the audience we're appealing to. She does not hold the values that we hold to. I gave her every benefit of the doubt. I gave her far more benefit of the doubt than I should have. And I'm done.
I've seen her say things without any evidence of her feeling a burden to back it up with a fact. Like, Richard Spencer is a Democratic plant. The Southern strategy never happened. That if you're going to argue that, you better know something that mainstream historians don't. But she seems to feel no burden to back those opinions up with evidence. When challenged on Joe Rogan about why she thinks climate change isn't real, she doesn't even have a single study to back it up. She's not a smart climate skeptic, or it's just her gut feeling against the view that she thinks is wrong. And when asked to back it up, often has nothing.
You don't think we have to care about the environment? Like, what do you...
No, not even a little bit. Do I believe in climate change? No.
You don't believe in climate change?
No. I think the climate always changes, I guess. I think that was just a way to extract dollars from Americans.
But this is an incredibly complicated subject.
Right.
And if you would have to talk to a bunch of different scientists and see how they gather data. Have you done all this? Or
no,
do you
so
take
I think,
this flippant opinion
based
on the party line?
This wouldn't be the hill I died on, right? But it's not about the party. I just genuinely, I've read a ton about it, but I would not be able to come to you and say, like, this is my strong opinion. Forget the fact of whether you believe global warming is real. Let's say it's 100% real. Let's say we know for a fact it's real. Is there a way?
Well, let's be clear.
Yeah.
Global warming, climate change is definitely real. It's happening.
Well,
the question
but
is,
it's
why
always
has it
happened.
happened? Yes, it has always happened.
So what is the climate change? Yes, the climate changes. It was different weather yesterday than it was today. The climate is forever changing. Like that's the problem, is that people are making it seem like that's something weird.
No,
that's
not. You're misrepresenting the issue.
Yeah, obviously her whole point is to get out there, get attention. She likes being provocative and inflammatory. That's her right. But, with that, you also have to face the consequences. And I think, too, just on some of the lack of education she has on these issues, which we'll get into on some of the specific claims, to couple not knowing the facts with extreme moral stridency, and then to get upset when you're called on it, I just think is,
Let's take a look at what Candace Owens is doing. Defending Andrew Tate, of course.
And I see these allegations of him being a rapist, human sex trafficking, whatever in Romania. And my take on this is that I do not believe that Andrew Tate is a rapist. I don't. I think that that is what people like to accuse men of when they're trying to take them down.
Bro, when you're right wing, these guys who otherwise would defend, like, they're defending sex work, which is crazy, which is not even sex work, it's sex trafficking. It's so strange to me that, like, in order to defend a sex trafficking right wing pervert, these people will literally turn around and start defending consensual sex work.
So a woman's worth is tied to her sexuality.
It's not tied to, well, absolutely. If you're going to be having multiple partners, you are going to be devaluing yourself.
You're worth less as a human being.
Not as a human being, just, in terms of trying to have a partnership and a productive relationship. Certainly men are not going to be clamoring to have a relationship with somebody when there's the market is growing them.
A man's response to your actions is what defines your worth, right?
Yeah. Well,
in one breathtaking moment of honesty, Candace Owens has laid bare the opaque foundation of modern conservative sexual politics. A woman's worth is directly proportional to how few people she's slept with. Not her achievements, not her character, not her contributions to society, just the number on her sexual odometer.
I would say that, yes, women have devalued themselves by becoming overtly sexual.
3 words. That's all it takes. Zena has spotted exactly what's happening here. Candace's answer is too vague, too slippery. Devalued themselves according to what standard? By whose measure? In whose eyes? To make a quick meta point, in philosophy, being evasive as Candace is being here isn't seen as clever. It's seen as a serious failure. If you can't clearly articulate your position, you're not effectively communicating your thesis. You're not doing philosophy, you're doing rhetoric. Real tell is how quickly her all-women claim crumbled under the slightest pressure. One clarifying question from Zena, and suddenly there are exceptions everywhere.
There could be an exceptional case for everything.
But they just don't matter, because Candace has appointed herself as the arbiter of which women's experiences count. Notice the pattern. These bold, supremely confident, sweeping claims that sound so powerful on stage, but with the tiniest amount of pressure, not even asking her to defend her position, just to clarify it, she crumbles into qualifications, exceptions, and backpedaling.
There could be an exceptional case.
It's almost as if these talking points are designed for applause lines, not for actual scrutiny.
Candace is actually saying something somewhat profound. She's saying, I will say whatever gets the most reward. She may not even know that that's what she's saying, but she's articulating audience capture as a virtue.
The life of Candace Owens. It works like this. I wake up, I stretch, have a cup of coffee, and then I'm served with a lawsuit. I love how she utterly omits the part where she uses her platform to endlessly libel people and thus richly deserves said lawsuits. So in this video, I would like to make the case that Candace Owens is not an honest broker of information. That's it, that's all. She has been caught in a multitude of lies about countless topics, ranging from medical misinformation, anti-feminist talking points, anti-Semitic propaganda, blood libels, falsehoods about the state of Israel and AIPAC, disinformation about the war in Gaza, disinformation about World War II, disinformation about the American education system, about evangelical Christianity, about Christian Zionism, about Zionism itself, of course, convicted serial rapists, alleged human traffickers and pornographers, the Charlie Kirk assassination, Brigitte Macron's genitalia, Emmanuel Macron's history, and countless calculated defamatory lies about her former friends, employers, and critics. I'll show examples of all of these. I've exhausted myself researching information about her, things she said, things other people have said about her. It's all been quite fascinating. But I'll definitely include them throughout the video series, and especially in the final video when we do the great debunking of Candace Owens. As a result of her many calculated lies and distortions and fake expertise expertise on topics that she researched shallowly and then distorted to serve her own ends, she has been thoroughly debunked and humiliated across the intrawebs for many years. We always say she lost her credibility recently, but that's not true. She never had credibility. And all the debunking that has gone on with regard to her content for years is something that her current viewers seem to have totally memory hold, because many of them continue to tune in and swear to her legitimacy and continue to treat her as though her reporting is done with even a modicum of journalistic integrity at this point, which is laughably stupid. Candace Owens is, and always has been, a fraudulent pseudo-intellectual, someone who managed to dupe both the left and the right by speaking loudly and rapidly and regurgitating all their favorite talking points in a convincing manner. She bewitched the world with what actually, looking back on it, was quite poorly delivered conspiratorial rantings dressed up as political rhetoric.
You don't think we have to care about the environment? Like,
No, not even a little bit.
Not even a little bit?
No. Do I believe in climate change? No.
You don't believe in climate change?
Well, I think the climate always changes, I guess is what I should say. Do I believe that this is like, an issue that is being, that is global warming, which they've changed conveniently. They got rid of the word once scientists started disproving it. Now they only say climate change. No, I think that was just a way to extract dollars from Americans.
But everyone was so fascinated by a young, relatively attractive, provocative, quasi-articulate Black woman.
If you can't compartmentalize, and a CEO and a chairman has to compartmentalize. The IDF even dropped napalm 12.5 miles off the coast of the Sinai Peninsula. Is that correct, when you arrive into the Sinai Peninsula?
Sinai.
Illiterate person in Portland, Oregon. The Hamptons debacle came out. The Hamptons, okay? Remember that whole debacle? We knew a kerfluffle happened.
Espousing conservative viewpoints that they tossed all other standards out of the window. The long and short of it is, Candace was an aberration. And because conservatives are forever fighting allegations of being white, stodgy, religiously bigoted neo-Nazis, they tend to break their necks propping up any and every aberration that happens to drift their way. Even those who are quite clearly just cashing in on the red pill grift and who hold exactly zero recognizably conservative positions. So for that reason, conservatives were easily duped by Candace Owens and amplified her to the fucking moon. And Candace, to her credit, realized early on the success she could garner in being an ideological aberration, and that became her grift essentially. From then on, no matter the absolute lunacy she would need to espouse to remain an aberration. And that's what we've been witnessing from her ever since, especially now. That's why she at times seems so puzzling to people, because she's trying to be an aberration for being an aberration's sake. Nothing about it is authentic. But these days, she's become representative of something far darker, spiritually speaking, malevolent even. I just really want to emphasize how she tends to frame information dishonestly in order to weaponize it and further her personal ideological crusades. Once you understand that basic premise, you are then empowered. You can go back and listen to Candace Owens, and she's completely demystified at that point. She no longer seems brilliant or intelligent or impressive. And more importantly, it's not just her, because there will be others. This will empower you to exercise greater caution, to approach information with a mind towards critical thinking instead of blindly consuming the slop spoon-fed to you by podcasters or traditional media, because it's a double-edged sword. It cuts both ways. Both are extremely biased and toxic and are just trying to indoctrinate you for their own purposes. So we can then be empowered to do our own research and seek out credible sources to inform our opinions on each individual topic you take interest in. Don't get everything from one place, and I certainly didn't do that with this video series. I looked at information from Candace from a multitude of different sources, both pro and against Candace. I even looked at Candace's content as well to some extent, but I also looked at arguments from people who were Zionists and people who are anti-Zionists, who all actually came together to condemn her and debunk debunk her. So I thought that was fascinating. And so you allow those different credible sources to inform your worldview first and foremost. It's probably best that you don't get all of your information from one place, because no one is an expert on everything and everyone has biases, including myself. I try to conscientiously set those aside when I'm doing something like this. I try to be objective and I try to be honest in the way I deliver the information. She is the exact opposite. She frames everything according to her biases. I'll show examples of that throughout this video series.
Because you work for the deep state and the Democratic Party and the CIA and MI6, and I see your ass. Let me give Candace Owens a little newsflash here. Bitch, you don't sit up there on some hill and tell me who ate the cabbage.
Erika Kirk is evil and was in on it, or Candace Owens is an evil cunt.
So, when Candace Owens says, I don't know, but I know, that is retarded. And we are all more retarded for having heard it.
And she does not live the way other people live. And she claims she liked Charlie, she loved Charlie, and she is burning everything down that he built because she is evil. She is evil.
Always bobbing her head. No, you don't say that. Oh, I'm Candace Owens, I'm cocky. What is with that cocky attitude? So unattractive, too, as a woman, so unattractive. She's the most cocky bitch I've ever seen in my life. Who the fuck wants that? Going around wagging her finger.
What I say about Candace is she's a bad friend. A friend wouldn't try to tear down Charlie's legacy.
What I am asking everybody, including Candace, is to please leave this woman alone. Let her grieve. Let her pick up the pieces of her shattered life in whatever way she sees fit.
Cult leader, conspiracist, lunatic, grifter, romantic reject, beard, anti-Semite, libeler, leftist psyop. These are just some of the countless colorful labels used by many across the web to explain the catastrophe that has become Candace Owens. The question is, why? What changed? How did this woman, who was once seen as one of the most courageous and gifted political commenters of color, become reduced to a slew of disreputable labels in such a short period of time? From feuding with Cardi B and Harry Styles, to being endorsed by Kanye West, to beefing with the president of France and the prime minister of Israel, Candace's jarring rhetoric and contrarian positions have seen her accumulate massive global influence in digital media, but also equal amounts of scorn. What is it about her that bugs everyone so much? Well, maybe I can try to answer that as someone who used to be a huge fan and admirer of hers. That is, until I began to see right through her. To put it plainly, Candace Owens has built an entire career, I kid you not, off of saying things that at times sound plausible, like on the surface, usually based on loosely connected dots or timelines that she tends to present, but in truth are rather specious. And don't get me wrong, most politicians and media pundits on both sides of the aisle engage in this kind of sophistry, unfortunately, to advance their causes, because everyone is so insanely tribalistic these days and are more concerned with winning than the truth. But Candace has taken this concept to unprecedented extremes, yet has somehow convinced a large portion of the world that she is an unparalleled truth teller. It's bonkers. An example of her making specious arguments would be, you can't just be widowed into CEO. Some people would innately agree with that statement, except you can technically be widowed into the role of CEO, not by bequeathment, but under special circumstances, particularly the ones that TPUSA found themselves in. If the CEO of an organization is also the founder of said organization, and the president, and the chief fundraiser, and the preeminent face of the company, and if a great deal of this success was based on his personality and image, it stands to reason that he would want the company to remain in the hands of his own family to continue his vision and legacy. Therefore, if it was the stated wish of Charlie Kirk in the event of his death that Erika Kirk take over as CEO of the organization he founded when he was only 18 and dedicated his entire adult life to and literally died for, and if the board of directors also agreed and approved Erika taking over as CEO by vote, which is what TPUSA did and publicly stated as much, then Erika Kirk very much can be widowed into CEO. See how some things actually require nuance to understand? So what Candace originally said sounded plausible to some, but was false, and was an obviously loaded statement because she always speaks in innuendo. What she meant is that she doesn't think Erika should be widowed into CEO. She was being intellectually dishonest based on her own biases, and she said it with the intention of making the world suspicious of Erika Kirk, which she has very much succeeded at, and to imply that Erika coveting the role of CEO might have been a motive for the assassination of Charlie Kirk. That's insanely deceptive and a huge leap considering the person who allegedly shot Charlie Kirk is in custody, was caught on multiple cameras tracking his path to and from the scene of the crime, was recognized by his family in the still from the videos, his DNA was found on the murder weapon, his private messages discuss committing the crime and returning to collect the weapon, and he confessed the crime to his family, who ultimately turned him in. Like his father turned him in, not a distant cousin, his father. And this man had previously expressed hatred towards Charlie Kirk and his politics at family gatherings. And there is zero available evidence that Erika Kirk had ties to this person or communicated with him in any way. Candace has nothing on Erika Kirk, so now she's planning to dig into her past to drum up a bunch of random things that she can spiral into just to get the world to distrust and hate Erika Kirk, which they already are. She now has to tell her audience how to feel about things. So when she plays clips of a perfectly normal meeting with Erika Kirk and TPUSA, she has to imply that something is wrong, that something is uncomfortable, so that her audience can feel the same way. It's just mind control. It's very cultish.
She's also telling you how to feel about something. In general, she is guiding her audience towards certain feelings and certain vibes she wants from a story. And throughout the process, truth and facts get jettisoned to instead wholly embrace this vibe. As we go through her various videos, you'll notice her evidence and argumentation is always very lacking, but it's very rich in style. And I think this is how she's reaching people. And what's even more alarming is the direction she's trying to push people towards. Not just one that ignores scientific consensus, but one that reinforces a lot of ugly political opinions.
And I'm not here to mount a defense for TPUSA, as I disagree with a lot that they've done, including platforming countless intellectually dishonest individuals who've gone off the deep end ideologically. So what they're experiencing right now with Candace Owens is sort of just them being forced to sleep in the bed they've made for themselves. And I suspect their relationship with other deceivers that they've routinely platformed to siphon off their audiences will end in much the same disastrous manner, because these people and their thoughts and their ideas are cancerous. Essentially, Candace makes claims that have the ring of common sense, and some even contain grains of truth, such as the age gap between Brigitte Macron and Emmanuel Macron when they first met, being 14 versus 39, was troubling, and the relationship they developed was creepy and inappropriate. That's totally fair, even though Macron was reportedly 15, and Candace may have lied to make it sound more incriminating, and even though the age of consent in France is 15, we can still recognize it is extremely predatory for a 39-year-old to romantically entertain a 15-year-old in any regard, or even wait on them to become an adult. That's fucking gross. Still, her framing of most facts in most stories is disingenuous at best, and worst, is purposefully misleading or loaded with innuendo to support her personal crusades, i.e. agendas.
She also has another conspiracy theory that I survived a shooting by my own brother, which is an absolute fabrication, and this is nuts. Because I've been very heavily criticizing her, she's now claimed that I'm in financial distress, suffering some kind of personal issue. I don't know, maybe it was the shooting at my property, I'll give her that one. And that I'm trying to sell my company, so I'm auditioning for Zionists. If that wasn't the best she could come up with, she then today claimed I survived a shooting committed by my own brother, which is the most insane thing anyone could ever possibly say. It is, accusing my own brother of trying to murder me is the stupidest thing imaginable.
So she takes a leap from there being an inappropriate age gap between the two to then conclude that Brigitte Macron is an unscrupulous person. And this therefore lends credence to the idea that Brigitte is secretly a biological male named Jean-Michel Trogneau and has stolen the identity of his dead sister, Brigitte Trogneau. And this transsexual person is also the blood relative of Emmanuel Macron and is therefore in an incestuous relationship with him. And oh yeah, Emmanuel was also brainwashed in an MK Ultra-esque government program and is now a Manchurian candidate or puppet president being mind controlled. And Brigitte Macron, back when she was still Jean-Michel, participated in the Stanford prison experiment, which led to him transitioning. And also the Macrons are part of a culture or a sadistic crime syndicate in France that protects perverts or something like that. And they are a part of an alleged conspiracy that involved Charlie being assassinated to distract from Candace investigating them.
We were getting very close to something as we had started on September 8th, by the way, our Becoming Brigitte season 2. As we were trying to determine whether or not it could have been Brigitte Macron that was involved in that Stanford experiment, this prisoner, 2093. And what really terrifies me is that if my inclination that Xavier Poussard's messages have been being read and tracked for longer than I even realized, and that's the reason they initially sent that cease and desist in December, was to ward me off sitting down with Xavier Poussard, then what we hadn't yet presented to the audience, but what we were investigating on the back end, if they were aware of that, it really makes me wonder if we were on the right track. And it was something that was so sinister, involving maybe another step of the MK Ultra program being used to foster serial killers and to give serial killers new identities and allowing them to run in countries. That was kind of conversations that I was having in the background with Xavier. And we thought that we had perhaps identified Brigitte Macron at Stanford University, a possibility is what I would say. We were maybe at a 50-50%. And then suddenly Charlie Kirk gets assassinated and it totally throws us off of the scent entirely because we're trying to figure out what happened to Charlie. And now, strangely, trying to figure out what happened to Charlie has brought us back to a France question, right?
And oh yeah, they also put $1 million hit on Candace's head for uncovering all their dirt. But don't worry, despite them knowing exactly where she lives, she hasn't been unalived yet. The more I read her insanity aloud, the clearer it becomes how severely mentally ill this woman is. Point being, Candace tells you 1 or 2 grains of truth to establish some semblance of credibility, and then endlessly piles absurd conspiracies atop, thereby trying to conflate the plausibility of everything she says to an undiscerning, conspiracy-obsessed audience. Again, this is not to mount a defense of the Macrons. I actually despise them politically. But the truth is the truth, regardless of your personal biases, which is something Candace does not understand in the least. We should have really known she would head in that direction anyway when she gave us this egregious answer in the early days with regard to Hitler and his intentions, and the choice she makes to frame this argument about Hitler through a lens of nationalism versus globalism. She brought Hitler up. I don't believe the questioner brought Hitler up. Candace specifically brought Hitler up to make this point, which is incredibly odd.
Yeah, I agree. I actually don't have any problems at all with the word nationalism. I think that it gets the definition gets poisoned by elitists that actually want globalism. Globalism is what I don't want. So when you think about, whenever we say nationalism, the first thing people think about, at least in America, is Hitler. He was a National Socialist, but if Hitler just wanted to make Germany great and have things run well, okay, fine. The problem is that he had dreams outside of Germany. He wanted to globalize. He wanted everybody to be German, everybody to be speaking German, everybody to look a different way. That's not, to me, that's not nationalism. So in thinking about how it could go bad down the line, I don't really I don't really have an issue with nationalism. I really don't. I think that it's okay. It's important to retain your country's identity and to make sure that what's happening here, which I think is incredibly worrisome in terms of the decrease in the birth rate that we're seeing in the UK, is what you kind of want to avoid. So I don't have I have no problems with nationalism. It's globalism that I try to avoid.
And she did so while utterly ignoring the hatred and racism and eugenics that informed his genocidal ideology. It wasn't for a second just about nationalism versus globalism. By no stretch of the imagination was what Hitler was doing in Germany okay, as long as it didn't breach their shores and expand to other nations. Everything he was doing, very fundamentally, was evil and psychotic. And you can read that in Mein Kampf, or whatever his book is called. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't believe at this point Candace said what she said with anti-Semitic intentions in mind. I don't even think she espoused those views at the time. But it's just an example of how she comments on things while being ill-informed, or later on, how she purposefully distorts information to frame it in a light favorable to the point she is endeavoring to make, which at the time was supporting the idea of nationalism because she was suddenly pro-Trump. And so this is an important example, not because she's now a raging anti-Semite. The example is important for the way she dishonestly frames information, or she frames information in such a way that reveals she's actually really ill-informed on the topic she's speaking on. And she does that a lot. She has convinced a lot of people she knows a lot more about topics she is clueless about. And the result every time you listen to her speak is insane mental gymnastics, and she's gotten away with it for years.
This movement saying we mustn't go to war in Europe again after the First World War. Do you think that those America First supporters then were right? Do you think that America shouldn't have gone into that Second World War?
Yeah, and that is a radical statement. People don't know how to deal with that because we've all been so brainwashed by the school system to believe that, well, look how great things are. Let me ask you about your country. Do you think that your country has become greater since? Has our country become greater since? Absolutely not. You know, this whole idea of international liberalism, now it's not just about your problems, it's about solving the world's problems.
There are many among us who in the past closed their eyes to events abroad because they believed that what was taking place in Europe was none of our business, that we could maintain our physical safety by retiring within our continental boundaries. To those who would not admit the possibility of the approaching storm, the past weeks have meant the shattering of many illusions.
They have taught us World War II history like we're children. Like, I mean, it's everything they've told us. Virtually everything they told us is either not true or a snippet of the truth, or omitting something that would make us question more of their narrative. And they freaked out when I shared a BBC documentary, no less, because they had tried to like wipe this from the universe about how Germans were ethnically cleansed. Following World War II. So there was no war going on. Immediately after, they allowed Stalin's to just go in. And
Poland, Czechoslovakia, they just wiped them off the face of the map.
If you assume that people, therefore, must know a lot about World War II, you then find out that actually Americans know nothing about World War II. My husband was amazed by this, by the way, obviously, because I'm in this sort of cross-national relationship. My husband was like, why do Americans always use Adolf Hitler as if, you know, he was the #1 mass murderer of the 20th century? He wasn't. What is this extreme focus on Nazis and Adolf Hitler as the only comparison we can ever make? And when I actually then started learning real history and I got out of the bubble of the American education system and I started recognizing these Soviet tactics of introducing really heavy concepts to kids while their brains are developing because you want to traumatize them. And you're traumatizing them because you want them to comply. And what you want them to comply with in this case is Germany, Nazi, Hitler, the greatest evil that's ever happened on Earth, even though factually and statistically it is not. It was coming across a huge fact that we ethnically, the Allies, ethnically cleansed 12 million Germans. Because when you say to people, okay, what is it about Hitler? Why is he the most evil? Well, the first thing people would say is, well, an ethnic cleansing almost took place. And now I offer back, you mean like we actually did to the Germans? Here's a clip again from that documentary I keep telling you that you have to watch. It premiered on BBC and it is entitled The Savage Peace.
First of all, she claims that the US education system is using Soviet Union tactics that are meant to shock and traumatize you as a child into compliance, to believe that Nazi Germany and Hitler were the greatest evil that happened on Earth, even though factually and statistically it is not, according to her. Notice how she develops an entire conspiracy about the American education system that she just presumes you will believe is true without showing any proof of what she's saying, and she doesn't back any of it up with supporting claims to show what the Soviet tactics are or how we applied them. And then she goes on to make the false claim that in America we are essentially explicitly told that Nazi Germany was the greatest evil that happened on Earth, when that is simply not true. At no point in school, in history class, was it impressed upon me that Nazi Germany was the greatest evil on Earth, mainly because how the hell do you statistically measure evil? Sure, there's objective evil acts, but how exactly do you measure them as compared to other atrocities statistically? Those metrics she's using are certainly subjective, because she then wants to follow up by claiming other people were more evil by her own subjective view of the atrocities they committed. That's her entire agenda here, and we all know who those people are. Meanwhile, throughout school, I've learned of countless other atrocities committed against humans throughout history, including the transatlantic slave trade, the Native American Trail of Tears, Jim Crow laws, and black lynchings in America, other genocides throughout history such as the Rwandan genocide, Vlad the Impaler, the Salem witch trials, people being burned alive and tortured by Catholics, especially during the Inquisitions, and none of that history was ever ranked and then offered the conclusive claim that Hitler was the greatest evil the earth has ever known. That is just totally not factual. Also, the idea that Hitler was the greatest evil the earth has ever known is subjective, and therefore people are free to feel that way, but that is not how the American education system is structured in the least. And mind you, she's likely trying to imply here that Jews control the education system, because I believe at one point she was trying to conflate Jews with the Soviet Union, something about the Bolsheviks, and therefore the American education system is selective and pro-Holocaust propaganda or something, which is insane and untrue. Also, the idea that the American perspective on the Holocaust is propaganda is something she implies later by stating that Joseph Mengel's experiments, you know, the formidable Nazi known as the Angel of Death, that they sound like propaganda and that no one would realistically take the time to do what he did. That shows you how trustworthy her framing of these things are. What she doesn't understand is that at times a greater emphasis was placed on the evils of the Holocaust because they were distinct in human history. Even the grossly oversimplified examples she tosses out in an attempt at trivializing the Holocaust to make it seem unexceptional or somehow equivalent to less cataclysmic human rights atrocities fall short of her goal. They all pale in comparison to the sheer scale and magnitude of the calculated atrocities of the Axis powers, the aggressors in World War II, especially the genocide of European Jews. Mind you, this is the same woman who will say with her full chest that the war in Gaza amounts to a Holocaust of the Palestinians, but what happened in World War II, the genocide of the European Jews, was nothing to write home about. Make it make sense. I'm sorry, were the European Jews given phone calls and text messages and flyers telling them to evacuate areas? Were evacuation paths opened up for them to safely make passage out of the war zones? Were there humanitarian corridors where global aid was facilitated into the war zone to help the enemy civilians? How does this compare to what happened in Gaza anyway? And how does she come to the conclusion that what's happening in Gaza warranted more panic than what happened to the European Jews during the Holocaust? What happened in Gaza is urban warfare. It's brutal, it's ugly, but it is not in any way analogous to what took place during the Holocaust during World War II. She tries to use the line that, oh, Israel is killing children, as though it's being done intentionally and gleefully, when children are just dying as collateral damage in a densely populated urban war zone. Children die in every war, unfortunately. Millions died in World War War II, which she constantly tries to downplay for some reason. Many children died during the Civil War. It didn't make the military objectives in that war any less justifiable. Many children died during World War I. Many children died during the American Revolution. Again, it doesn't change whether or not the military objectives are warranted. So the point here is to show how she will arbitrarily decide to minimize or trivialize atrocities that were, the scale of which were just completely immeasurable. The horrors of the Holocaust were almost immeasurable. She will downplay that, but then she will completely over-exaggerate what took place in Gaza.
When I started to examine many of the allegations against Israel in the world, I saw that anything goes. You can accuse Israel of anything, and many people will believe it. You can accuse Israel of rape, though Israeli soldiers almost never raped in Israeli military history, though some cases in 1948, but other than that, almost nothing. You are seeing that we are accused of mass massacres, virtually with zero evidence. We see that everything that a Hamas-affiliated person or organization says is gospel truth. But when the IDF brings forensic evidence, aerial photos, data captured Hamas documents, nobody listens. And this is the beginning of our journey. What we try to do is not to give moral or legal assessments, at least not in the beginning. We try to get the facts straight, because we believe is that before you jump to moral and legal assessments, you need to know what happens. It's like a multi-storied building. The first story is the facts. And when you try to jump to your preferred legal or moral conclusion before establishing the facts, you get the genocide allegations, these kind of completely distorted, unverified accusations.
And what your perspective as a lawyer is on all of that.
I think the first thing to understand is the context for the use of both genocide, apartheid, and many other terms that have a legal origin, but no legal basis in terms of their application to Israel. I'd say no legal or factual basis. And the reasons that these terms are being deployed. I've talked about this in other contexts as the modern blood libel. So if you think about scholars who've talked about the evolution of anti-Semitism, something that started in the Middle Ages with a focus on the Jews as a religion, evolved, and when science took over from religion as the order of the day, the hatred of the Jews, anti-Semitism, manifested itself in a hatred of the Jewish race. And that was a time when the pseudoscience of eugenics was used in order to justify that hatred. But today, we've moved away from that in the context of international law and human rights being the order of the day. The late, great former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, Lord Jonathan Sacks, talked about how anti-Semitism today manifests itself in a hatred of the Jewish state in that context of international law and human rights. And what we see with the terms that you've raised is modern blood libels being deployed. So while in the 18th or even before that, in the Middle Ages, Jews were accused of killing Christian children to use their blood for religious rituals. Today, we have these notions of Israel targeting children, which is abhorrently false. We have these notions of genocide being propagated, another blood libel. In terms of, I'll come back on to the legal definition of the term, because I completely accept what you say, which is that the images that so many people are basing these false conclusions on are horrific, and they need to be understood in their proper context. So this is footage coming out of Gaza, which is controlled by Hamas, and is serving a very clear propaganda aim of an internationally prescribed terrorist organization that is abusing its own people and using civilians as human shields and celebrating any civilian casualties in Gaza. So quite apart from the fact that we will not know the story behind the images that you're referring to, simply because Hamas controls Gaza absolutely, and no information that is not approved by Hamas is making it out into the international discourse at the moment. Quite apart from that, the attribution of these horrific images is to
Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist organizations, because this is their aim. They have, at the moment, only one objective, and that is survival. And the way that they ensure, in their minds, their survival and their ability to continue to threaten Israeli civilians and carry out this threat, specific threat of conducting the 7th of October over and over again, the way that they seek to ensure being able to do that is by driving up international pressure against Israel with these propaganda images and messages. And the use of the term genocide is unbelievably pernicious. This was a term that was coined, in fact, to give terminology to the Jewish experience in the Holocaust.
In my view, the deepest tragedy in the war right now is that both sides have committed war crimes, and in both cases, those war crimes are falling on Palestinian civilians. The truth, of course, is that every war features war crimes, but usually each army commits those crimes against the enemy's population. In this case, the Palestinians of Gaza have received a double dose of the excesses of each side. But here's the crucial point. That doesn't make both sides morally equal. Let me begin by making something clear. When I say that the Israelis are the good guys in this war, I'm not saying that everything the IDF does is justifiable. Far from it. And I'm not saying that Israeli soldiers haven't committed war crimes. Certainly they have. What I mean is that Israel's goals as a country are far more benign and ethical than Hamas's goals. Israel's goal is to live in peace with its neighbors. Now, you can focus on the far-right faction within Israel that wants more than that, but it's just that. It's one faction within a democracy. By and large, Israelis don't want to conquer Gaza. In fact, they left Gaza voluntarily in 2005, and they don't want to wipe Gaza off the map. If they wanted that, they could have done it any time in the last several decades. With their advantage and firepower, they could do it now in a matter of weeks. And you should ask yourself why they don't. Hamas, on the other hand, does want to conquer Israel and wipe it off the map. And they would be happy to do what they did on October 7th to the entire country. That's what I mean when I say that the two sides in this war are not the same. There is a huge moral asymmetry between them, and that matters. What's unique about this war, unlike every other war that I could think of, is you have an army in Hamas that has perfected the art of embedding itself and meshing itself with civilians so that you cannot hit them without hitting the people around them. Other armies have done this, but none have perfected it to the extent that Hamas has. No army that I know of in military history has had 15 years to build 300 miles of tunnel underneath a city that they don't use to shelter the civilians, but they use to shelter themselves so that they can operate right under a kindergarten, right under a mosque. So this is a challenge no army has faced. And so that's what makes this war different. And yes, I agree with all of the absolute tragedy and suffering of the Palestinian people, but it's what creates that is the way Hamas fights. And either we can say one of two things. We can either say, well, Israel doesn't have a clean shot, and so they have to let Hamas get away with it because it's too much to bear. But then we are essentially creating a situation where terrorists have found the perfect solution, which is that you can cross the border, go house to house slaughtering your enemies, and then hide behind your own people and they can do nothing about it. It's a perfect strategy. Can we live in a world where we allow that to be an acceptable strategy? I don't think so. And it's very ugly to watch. It's heartbreaking, and I completely understand why people don't think the way I think when they see the videos. I completely get it. But I don't think we can actually live in a world where that's allowed to be a strategy. Is it Israel's fault that its own civilians are incredibly well protected by defensive infrastructure like the Iron Dome and bomb shelters? Is it Israel's fault that Hamas has built one of the most extensive networks of underground bomb shelters in the history of warfare, but doesn't allow its own civilians to enter them? Is it Israel's fault that Hamas uses children as lookouts, thereby turning them into combatants under the international laws of war? Because when we hold Israel alone responsible for the civilian death toll in Gaza, a death toll that results directly from Hamas's barbaric style of warfare, we are implicitly holding Israel responsible for Hamas's war crimes against the Palestinians. Now, it's incredibly easy to lose sight of this, given the mainstream media bias on the topic. For instance, the New York Times released a story on July 24th entitled, "Gazans Are Dying of Starvation." The article relied on testimony from several doctors working in Gaza, as well as the Gaza Health Ministry, and it used that to build a case that deaths from starvation are on the rise. In the article, there was one photo that stood out. It was a photo of a mother holding an emaciated skeletal infant named Mohammed Zakaria al-Mutawak. This photo was displayed prominently on the front page of the physical edition of the New York Times and made the rounds on social media. You almost certainly saw it. And importantly, it was the only photo in the article that clearly suggested starvation as opposed to chaotic, hungry refugees. And it wasn't long before sleuths on X discovered that there was another photo, which the Times chose to omit, of the boy and his mother next to his 3-year-old brother, who clearly isn't starving. So if there's no food, why is the 3-year-old not also thin? It turns out this young boy didn't look emaciated because of starvation conditions. In fact, he was born with serious disease, perhaps cerebral palsy or hypoxia. It's not yet clear. But 6 days after the article came out, the New York Times had to issue a correction, noting that the boy was born with unrelated health issues that account for his skeletal appearance. Now, if such crucial information could be left out of the original article, what other information was left out? Now, let me be clear here. I'm not saying there isn't hunger or food insecurity or humanitarian disaster in Gaza. Of course there is. What I'm saying is that the pipeline that's feeding you information about the humanitarian disaster in Gaza is fundamentally broken, biased, untrustworthy, and weaponized against Israel.
Demilitarization is not genocide. Urban warfare is not genocide. But she will purposefully conflate the two, and she will purposefully over-embellish one while minimizing or trivializing the other. The one that was truly, by every metric, objectively more horrific. So she is not an honest broker of information. You can sympathize with the Palestinian plight and the deaths that have taken place in Palestine without equating it to the Holocaust. But she's doing that for a reason. because she wants to demonize the Jews while minimizing the atrocities committed against the Jews. But I digress. Every example she brought up, these other atrocities, although they were atrocities or human rights violations, they pale in comparison to what took place in the Holocaust. So I don't understand the points being made here, especially the very evident ulterior motive of painting Hitler or the Nazis in a more favorable, less severe light, and then vilifying us instead, which is just pure idiocy at play. Her Nazi propaganda and sick revisionist history, which she clearly prefers we were taught, and which she keeps laughably asserting is real history without bothering to prove why her make-believe World War II scholarship outweighs that of credentialed historians, is just beneath contempt at this point. The Holocaust was distinct. That is irrefutable, no matter how much she and other anti-Semitic loons like to pretend it wasn't. Meaning, the Holocaust was unprecedented, and the scale of the damage was enormous as far as the casualties and the societal impact of these atrocities, especially after the war, which goes to her point about post-war ethnic cleansing of Germans from Eastern Europe. And World War II as a whole is looked on in a unique light because it took place in recent human history, and many people's grandparents were affected by it, either as Holocaust survivors or as veterans in the deadliest war in human history. My grandparents lived through both. When Pearl Harbor was bombed, my grandparents were alive, and it was a globally dark time in human history, an appalling glimpse at the ugliness at the center of human nature. So yes, greater emphasis is placed upon that evil because it took countless world powers aligning to stop it, and it forever shifted the framework of global supremacy and Western hegemony, especially the US being the global ruling power. And it's important for us to know what led to these atrocities so we will not repeat them or allow them to be repeated by others. This has become the bedrock of US involvement in world affairs since World War II, apart from us pursuing our own interest, of course. And the point is to try to help uphold democracy and deter tyrannical powers from overtaking the world.
It was coming across a huge fact that we ethnically, the Allies, ethnically cleansed it was coming across a huge fact that we ethnically, the Allies, ethnically cleansed 12 million Germans. Because when you say to people, okay, what is it about Hitler? Why is he the most evil? Well, the first thing people would say is, well, an ethnic cleansing almost took place. And now I offer back, you mean like we actually did to the Germans?
She's purposefully conflating ethnic cleansing with genocide, definitionally, so that she can then trivialize what happened to the Jews at Hitler's hands and suggest that what happened to the Germans was worse. Even though millions of Jews died and hundreds of thousands of Germans died during this ethnic cleansing that she's exploiting to make her anti-Semitic points. And the ethnic cleansing of Germans after World War II is not history that was purposefully buried or that is inaccessible. She's literally talking about it because she saw it in a documentary, and the history is readily available to anyone who wants to read it. Not all of human history can be discussed in class, so they typically stick to the main events for each era. She says Hitler almost committed an ethnic cleansing cleansing, but we actually committed an ethnic cleansing against the Germans. This framing is incredibly deceptive and meant to favor Hitler and vilify us in an insane revisionist manipulation. Regardless of Hitler's failed ethnic cleansing of Jews at the beginning of the war, in the end, there was a genocide of the Jews, not a forced expulsion from the land. Those two things, ethnic cleansing and genocide, have distinct definitions, with one being far more deadly. There was a systematic and industrial mass murder of Europe's Jewry, totaling over 6 million deaths, in addition to other groups who were targeted. That is not ethnic cleansing. That is targeted, intentional genocide to erase multiple ethnic groups and different intrinsic identities, like people who are gay or disabled, trying to wipe them from the earth. They are dead, not ethnically cleansed. 2/3 of the Jews in Europe, which was a little over 9 million at the time, were murdered. Nazis literally engineered new methods to mass murder people in meetings. They had death squads killing people in the streets, like the Einsatzgruppen, who were responsible for mass shootings. Jews were herded into sealed ghettos. Food rations were deliberately kept low, far below survival levels, meaning mass systematic starvation. There was also mass rape and weaponized sexual violence. The elderly died from starvation and disease. Children were also starved, and torturous experiments were performed on them without anesthesia. They were subjected to infections and amputations and injections of chemicals, not to mention the twin experiments performed by Joseph Mengele, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correct, Mengele, which were primarily performed on children.
But then you move on to the experimentation. Yes, of course, that's been embedded into our minds. The Nazis experimented on innocent people. Candace, come on, that's the difference. They experimented on twins. I mean, some of the stories, by the way, sound completely absurd. I'm like, the idea that they just cut a human up and then sewed them back together. Why would you do that? Literally, even if you're the most evil person in the world, that's a tremendous waste of time and supplies. Just slice a person in half and sew them together. That just sounds like bizarre propaganda, but let's just go with it. Let's say that that's actually true.
Many of the children and babies were also ripped away from their parents and killed upon arrival at extermination camps because they were essentially useless. Children were often gassed or shot and at times subjected to sexual exploitation. Approximately 1.5 million children alone were killed during the Holocaust. Dead bodies of all ages were left in the streets. Millions, including older children, were subjected to forced labor in camps, factories, mines, and construction work. Prisoners worked 12 to 16 hours a day with little food and no medical care. So they were literally worked to death. We've seen the photos. Now let's talk about this language of we in this clip, shall we? Candace essentially claims the US ethnically cleansed 12 million Germans after World War II, which is a complete lie. Let's contextualize this. She's tossing out that number 12 million because she thinks it trumps the 6 million Jews who were actually exterminated. It's all a matter of deceptive rhetoric to make you emotional and outraged and make you feel lied to. As we all know, war is hell. It's chaos and pandemonium, and the strongest and most strategic usually wins. It is no secret, and it is not buried history, that Allied powers did not work perfectly during World War II. I don't think anyone would actually claim we did. But Allied powers were tremendously courageous, and they were fighting to restore democracy across the world. The very democracy Candace enjoys and clearly takes for granted, as she constantly shields for communist hellholes or brutal Islamic theocracies.
If you still listen to Candace Owens because you are under the false impression that she is either a real Christian, a real conservative, or a rational human being, then allow me to pop that bubble using her own words. So recently, Candace Owens took to her X account to slander the persecuted church and Christians in China who are known to meet underground by accusing them of having been established by Mossad and the CIA, who in her words also engage in global trafficking. Now, what's Candace Owens' reason for accusing the persecuted church in China of being established or in cahoots with Mossad and the CIA? Well, she was retweeting another X account called Commie Pommy, who basically defended China's actions in heavily persecuting the underground church because the underground church happens to be unregistered. So in this person's mind, and in Candace Owens' mind, the underground church being unregistered means that they are suspicious. Now, many actual Christians who do research on Christian persecution around the world understand that the church in China has long been underground and unregistered to avoid being used as a propaganda tool by the Chinese Communist Party. As stated by Open Doors, an organization that heavily monitors Christian persecution around the world, while there are registered churches in China, these are closely overseen by the state, which monitors what is preached and who is present. Under 18s are not permitted to attend. These strictures are to ensure the sinicization of churches, that is, the aligning of religious doctrine with communist ideology. This intrusion means that many churches decide not to register, meeting underground instead as house churches. So instead of Candace Owens doing actual research on why these churches are unregistered, she chose instead to use her massive platform to slander the persecuted Christians in China and spread propaganda. Communist propaganda at that. Let's not forget that some weeks ago, she also underplayed the very real danger of radical Islam, and anybody who does any actual research on Christian persecution around the world knows that Christian persecution around the globe mainly comes from Islam and communism. Now, why does Candace Owens, the Christian and the conservative podcaster, seem to be supporting both communism and radical Islam, which are in direct opposition to Christianity and which are heavily persecuting the church globally? I don't know. Ask yourself that question.
The early 20th century in general was one of the deadliest times in human history, also one of the darkest, ideologically speaking. Men who believed in the sanctity of life and the sanctity of democracy rose to the occasion and sent those motherfuckers back to hell. They are titans and defenders of Western civilization.
Why we know this is that we have all this revisionism now. There's this Western self-loathing. We bombed Dresden, we bombed Hamburg, we bombed Tokyo, and we did. And
the atomic bombs as well.
Yes, and that was probably 1 million people died in Germany and Japan put together through Allied bombing. But if you want to be exact about it, in one sense, World War II was the story of German soldiers and the government's support of that military effort to kill Russians, Poles, and Jews. And the Japanese government's soldiers and the government's support of that to kill Chinese civilians, Pacific Islanders, and Southeast Asians. And if you add all of those numbers up, and when I wrote the book, 60 million was considered the conservative estimate, but now I think people say it might, some recent research said it might be 70 or 75 million because the Russians were not transparent about how many they lost, nor were the Chinese. And you take those figures and then you look at the actual numbers of Germans who died, civilian and military, maybe 3 million, maybe 3.5, or the number of Japanese, 2.5 to 3 million. You end up with the most lethal kill ratio. So the people that we say were being terrorized by us actually were killing machines. In other words, at the loss of 3 or 4 million people, the German army in Russia probably killed somewhere around 25 to 30 million Russians. They killed 6 million in the death camps, and they probably killed another 2 million of people in Eastern Europe and Allied soldiers.
And by and large civilians, again,
yes.
we're talking about.
And Japan was even more lethal. They probably lost 2.5 million people. They were not bombed, see, until basically in 1945, the homeland. If you count all of their civilian and all their military dead, and then you put on the other side of the ledger what they were unleashed on China, and that was just they targeted civilians almost exclusively. They had targeted people in the Philippines when they took over. They targeted people in Southeast Asia. They targeted people in Malaysia. Of course, the Allies as well. And Japan probably they probably killed somewhere between 20 and 25 people at the cost of 2.5. So what I'm trying to say is they killed 10 times more people than they suffered. And that was not true if you look at the British or the Americans. And so when the revisionists say, well, Churchill was a terrorist, or we were doing this, they have no idea of the actual data of all these millions of people who died by the direct policies of the Japanese imperial government, or the Germans. And I get very upset sometimes when the revisionists about the atomic bombs or the fire raids, they go the next step and they start to champion the Japanese. Kind of feeds into the DEI whole industry as well, of revisionism. And I don't think they have any idea that in 1941, 42, 43, 44, 45, people in Asia were terrified of the Japanese. They were considered lethal killers. And if you did not obey them, they killed you, whether it was in Manchuria or Mongolia or earlier in 19th. And the same was true of the Germans. They had a reputation of as very lethal killers. And I don't think people understand that.
Leaders like Churchill and FDR, though flawed, were faced with impossible, unprecedented evil in the likes of Hitler and Imperial Japan, but stared them down and obliterated them by any means necessary for the greater good. That's why we're all here and free and happy today. They were fighting this incomprehensible evil on multiple fronts and countered it with brutal, decisive acts made under the duress of wartime mayhem. This is often distorted, and they try to say Japan was trying to surrender when we dropped the bombs, which isn't true, which is why we dropped the second bomb, and then they surrendered. So no one is arguing everything we did was correct or moral, but much of what they did, though brutal, actually saved millions of lives. And yes, that was at the expense of collateral damage, but it was for the greater good ultimately. There is always collateral damage in war. No one is ignoring that. The world benefited from American involvement in World War II, including Americans. Japan actually bombed us. I'm so confused. Would she have preferred it that way, that we were overtaken by these powers? As she sits on her pathetic soapbox, impugning the incredible men who fought and died for the very freedoms that give her the right to spew her absolute brain-dead filth across the internet, she frames information in bad faith. She's not actually concerned for the ethnically cleansed Germans of Eastern Europe. She's just gleeful she found information convenient to her reframing of World War II and her Holocaust denial, and trying to vilify Jews by wrongly conflating them with the actions of the USSR and vilify us for fighting to save the Jews from Hitler. She also frames this as though the United States was involved in the systematic ethnic cleansing, like on the ground, when in truth, the ethnic cleansing of Germans from Eastern Europe was carried out primarily by post-war local authorities in Poland, Czechoslovakia at the time, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union. Yes, it was often done with violence by militias and civilians and led to the death of hundreds of thousands of Germans. These things were typically done out of a lust for revenge or out of fear that the Germans would try to revolt again or reassert power someday after the immense destruction caused by Nazi occupation. These Germans were typically settled in these areas for the purposes of colonizing them, and the brutal killings of the native populations during German occupation must be taken into consideration. The social fabric in these areas was completely ripped to shreds, thanks to the Germans. And with that comes a lust for revenge in those who were wronged and demoralized and who lost loved ones or their quality of life, and it makes them quite amoral. These expulsions or the resettlement was internationally sanctioned at the time, but the execution of these expulsions were not directly carried out by the United States. At the Potsdam Conference of 1945, the US, Britain, and Soviet Union agreed that the remaining German populations would be transferred to Germany in an orderly and humane manner, but because they did not oversee it, which you can fault them for certainly, this standard they demanded was frequently violated on the ground by Eastern Europe authorities and especially Soviet-controlled authorities. The United States did not organize, carry out, or police these expulsions, and they had little control over what took place in Soviet-occupied territories where the worst of the abuses occurred. So yes, what happened to these Germans in Eastern Europe, meaning the forcible expulsion of them, which resulted in human rights abuses, murder, and mass rape, was a post-war atrocity. No one denies that. It was a horribly botched implementation of this internationally agreed upon resettlement, with nefarious players taking advantage of the post-war societal collapse that created the conditions for such atrocities to occur. But let's not forget who caused it all to begin with: Hitler. And it's also important to note that Western Allied powers did not intentionally punish the Germans. I can't say the same for the Soviet Union because they were never a moral force throughout this entire war. Western Allied powers helped to resettle and rebuild Germany through reconstruction efforts, which is why Germany is here today.
And I decided that, you know what, this is not my platform, okay? I genuinely believe this is God's platform. I am a conduit. I don't know why I have a platform. And
Still gonna be your platform in court, Candy. It's God's platform is not gonna be a legal defense to defamation.
And I went to church and I prayed and I said, give me something. And it was the first email, just like I said to you. I mean, what did I call 4 minutes after the email was sent? And it was actually me. I didn't send it to like my producer. I was just like, hey, maybe this is it. And I can't help but to see God in that.
Candace is engaged in a project of self-aggrandizement.
Candace does and says anything she can to foment distrust and hatred of the people she hates or has deemed her enemies. That's the lens through which all of her information should be viewed. I have since come to greatly loathe everything Candace is, everything she represents, everything she says, and even the sound of her voice. Like, why does she try to sound so menacing when she speaks? It makes my skin crawl.
Jewish people were in control of the slave trade. They've buried a lot of it. By the way, I forgot to mention, Erika, if you could do me a favor. Doug DeGroot, that board member that announced you as the CEO, he made it really biblical. Could you send him my regards? I know he was meeting with Mikey the other day. Just send him my regards because we're everywhere and we're watching and we're listening.
Who exactly does she think she's intimidating with that cringe, snarky delivery? You can tell she loves the sound of her own voice and is so arrogant and self-assured in her delivery, but then we end up with things like this.
Race kerfluffle, ways you can honor Charlie. Stop telling us that it has to always be Miss Macabre, like retired Green Beret. At last I check, everybody uses the terminology blitz, Blitzkrieg. Everybody uses the term Blitzkrieg. And so I called it Blitzkrieg Week. Jewish people were in control of the slave trade. They've buried a lot of it. Buried the Charlie Kirk story. What about his burial? How come we haven't seen anything about his burial?
Night by Elie Wiesel.
Night by Elie Wiesel. Mentioning Elie Wiesel. Elie Wiesel.
Do you have a favorite book?
I read a lot. I don't know if I have a favorite book. Oh.
Nothing favorite? All right, I'll take it.
Because that's what she is. She's illiterate.
She is a laughingstock, and how convenient that she can just summarily frame any online criticism of her as a Zionist psyop to try to dissuade her audience from taking it seriously and seeing what a joke she is. And that includes X trends, which are generated by AI, I believe, because she's become increasingly unpopular and the butt of most online jokes for the imbecilic things she says, like, why is ice not melting in 30-degree Fahrenheit temperatures? So now, because she can't take any criticism or any mocking or humiliation, even though she doles it out every day to other people, usually innocent people, the X trends are now a Zionist psyop and are not accurately depicting what's trending in the moment. Her viewership must be comprised of like 16-year-old TikTok users and bored gossipy housewives who are used to consuming garbage reality TV and are addicted to tabloids and foreign bots, by the way, because otherwise I cannot fathom how anyone could watch her and find her honest or intellectual or brilliant when she's just become the digital version of the National Enquirer. And I suspect a lot of her audience are just hate watching her at this point. I stopped listening to her several years ago when she first began working for the Daily Wire because I just didn't find her content edifying and was kind of annoyed by her delivery. That's something I'm still annoyed by the way. I couldn't stand the way she seemed to think shouting and talking fast and being snarky constituted a good argument. I just found her all bark and no true intellectual rigor or bite. Her personality is very cringe, and she's become increasingly more transparent to me. Her whole ruthless truth teller stick grew stale pretty fast. And of course, with my mentioning Candace on a YouTube post on my small channel and how I no longer watch her content, one of her demented fans came by accusing another commenter of being a paid shill for simply offering mild criticism, and also saying I couldn't assess the veracity of her claims since I don't watch her show anymore. This statement is of course moronic because there is enough material floating around out there of Candace outright lying and being shut down in interviews and being embarrassed in debates and relying on fallacies and rhetorical tricks to weasel her way out of defending her own claims, and enough material out there of her saying outlandish things that fundamentally discredit her, such as Elon Musk being a robot or cyborg or something, or that Jews were killing Christians during Passover to drink their blood, or that Stalin was a Jew.
And she's calling them the Bolshevists, and she says that, you know, she gets all the details wrong about that. And then she says Stalin was Jewish. Stalin was not Jewish. You know, I said, oh, well, you know, not everyone's perfect. I said, yeah, it's not really a good look, but, you know, she's learning. I said she's going to get on the ball eventually. So I didn't say anything. I held my tongue, even though that was not really a good look. Okay, you can't really go hard like that and stake the reputation of you and everybody on this and then, like, get it wrong really severely over and over. She's talking about, you know, all this stuff that, like, it just doesn't even really make any sense.
You don't have to watch every second of her very incoherent, agenda-laced rambling to see how erroneous and epistemically flawed it is. We're talking very basic logic here. You don't have to go granular to debunk her. You can discredit her at a fundamental level and save yourself a lot of time. Because if the foundation of someone's reasoning is dishonest and systematically flawed, then little that they conclude will be valid or worthy of your trust. She's a low IQ conspiracy theorist whose theories and mental gymnastics switch every day because she is being debunked at an unprecedented rate. She therefore has to make up new things as she goes along and drops off of some of the other things she claimed without proving them, like all pathological liars do. Her main arguments are psychotic, definitionally, and often self-defeating, especially as they pertain to the assassination of Charlie Kirk, where she has accused Israel, Egyptian planes, France, the US military, TPUSA, random people wearing maroon shirts, and some insane bee cult of being responsible for his death.
You know, my problem with her is the way she thinks. Ironically, Kanye famously tweeted, "I love the way Candace Owens thinks," but it's precisely the way she thinks that's the problem. Which is to say, there are many things that I agree with her on. Her general critique of the left on race issues is often spot on, but it's the way she thinks that's the problem, because it's often not evidence-based at all, which leads her to say these things that are patently false.
Epistemological failure is just a fancy way of saying Candace is unintelligent and dishonest and doesn't understand how critical thinking or logic or objectivity works. And I'm not just saying that to be an asshole. I'm saying that because it's critically important. If you've ever watched her content, have you ever noticed how nothing you've gleaned from her has been substantive or definitive? Especially lately. It's just cynicism and suspicion and indictment, just asking questions, repackaged as groundbreaking investigations, which never actually reach a conclusion. Endless, bewildering speculation to both confuse and enthrall you to her delusional rantings week after week, and there is never any true payoff for the audience. Dinesh D'Souza said it best when he called her content an intellectual striptease, except in my opinion, it's heavy on the teasing and criminally light on the intellect. She, like most conspiracy theorists, tend to overwhelm you with useless, irrelevant facts, non-probative information like I mentioned earlier, that she puts neatly into graphics to give her list a guise of credibility, half-cocked theories that you sort of lose the thread on and she never revisits, glaring plot holes, and bottomless rabbit holes, because in that case, it's an incentive structure for you to continually tune in, and it also provides grounds for her and her sycophantic fans to claim that if you cannot debunk every theory and allegation, many of which are straight up unfalsifiable, like the content of her dreams, then that means Candace must be right.
If you've ever watched one of our episodes, you'll notice it immediately. The odd footage, the timestamps, things that don't line up, the screenshots that don't make sense, and the random people who suddenly seem suspicious. But she doesn't just give you one or two of these. Every episode, she throws out more than you can count. Nearly 15 in this video alone, sometimes over 20. In fact, I say that this is virtually the entirety of her episodes. She gathers anything that could look suspicious, even if it could be random or unrelated.
On 9/4, Akash Patel as far as November and December. Then we have Frank Turek on October 7th. Well, Megyn Kelly.
With so many anomalies being introduced every episode, at least a couple of them will strike you as strange, and given the sheer volume of her claims, your ability to think carefully about any of them gets drawn out by the sheer number of them. By the time you start to think critically about one date, or rumor, or insinuation, she's already moved on to the next. So eventually what happens is you stop paying attention to the quality of the evidence, and you're overwhelmed by the quantity, leaving you to conclude that there's just simply too many strange things occurring for there not to be something more going on. This can be thought of as an anomaly overload. It's what happens when a flood of speculation starts to feel like evidence, and when the gaps in our knowledge become proof that something sinister is happening.
What's going on here? What are Egyptian military subcontractors doing in the middle of Provo, Utah on the day that Charlie Kirk was assassinated?
And even though she hasn't proven anything yet, within one episode, you've already moved on from curious to convinced.
And she also uses top secret sources to position herself as an authority on any narrative she wants to commandeer for her own gain. We've seen her do this with the Blake versus Justin drama, her beef with the Daily Wire, the Charlie Kirk assassination, the French government assassination plot, so forth and so on. It's just a continual appeal to authority of her unnamed sources. To some extent, yes, journalists do have legit sources who are sometimes integral to breaking stories, but the point of journalism is to approach information in good faith and to uncover the truth for the common good, not to endlessly string your audience along, never arriving at a concrete conclusion so that you can keep milking them for clicks and engagement, or weaponizing the information you've obtained from these sources strictly to assassinate characters, disparage former employers, or blackmail critics, basically meting out petty vengeances like a supervillain, because that makes someone a bad faith actor, and bad faith actors are utterly undeserving of your time and especially your trust. There are far too many real independent journalists out here doing their jobs on the ground at the scene of the action with true grit, courage, and integrity, and whose objective is indeed the common good, not relentless self-interest.
She just said they don't share the investigative process with the victim. Do you understand what the problem is there? Do you guys catch this? Do you understand why this is a very revealing moment here? So let me slow this down. So what she just said right there is incredibly revealing, because it gives away the entire game. Okay, she doesn't have any idea how this works at all. She's framing this as if TPUSA they're hiding the evidence somehow, that somehow Turning Point USA is involved in some giant cover-up or something, and that Erika Kirk is supposed to be briefed by the prosecutors and handed discovery packets like party favors or something. Guys, this is not how the criminal justice system works. Okay, that is not how it's ever worked. Did Candace really believe that she was going to show up over here and they were just going to hand her some evidence packet or something? I think so. They're not going to do that. In fact, they are legally and ethically prohibited from doing that. And the investigation is, I'm not going to tell anybody. They can't give you that. That is illegal. Investigation is not shared with the public. It's not shared with families or employers or anything like that. That is how you preserve a prosecution. It's how you avoid mistrials. You don't just got to blow up the case because, Candace Owens showed up at Turning Point. What was she thinking was going to happen here? That the entire state's prosecution, the strategy was going to be given to her? And this really is where it's embarrassing for her, though, and this is why I wanted to bring this up, because she's positioning herself as some kind of truth-telling investigator, but she doesn't seem to have the most basic understandings and distinction between a victim, a witness, a private organization, and the state. She's shocked that TPUSA didn't show up with some manila folder labeled State of Utah State secret evidence. That Turning Point has any control over this, how it's handled. They never did. They legally can't.
With that being said, Candace, no matter how much she tries to assert it, does not argue from a place of good faith. Her biases are plain spoken and undeniable. I don't even think her audience would deny that her biases are very plain and clear to see. She argues from a place of ruthlessly protecting her own presuppositions and proving her wild conjecture, regardless of where the facts lead. That is not journalism. That is desperate confirmation bias. She is cosplaying a journalist when she's more like a 10 tin-hat freak spewing sweltering delusions from the comfort of a padded cell, or, her basement, where she homeschools those poor children. You can simply illustrate her consistent epistemic failures because these errors in how she measures the validity of information, as well as her pretense of critical thinking, and her reversing the burden of proof onto those she wildly accuses, all erode the foundation of her entire belief system and thus her credibility. How she even determines information to be true or trustworthy is of critical importance, because as a listener of her content, people need to know if her process for vetting information is acceptably rigorous or reliable, especially because she dedicates so much of her time to getting you to mistrust the established narratives and the established facts, like in the Charlie Kirk assassination. She does not promote healthy skepticism or spiritual discernment. Like a true schizo, she fosters paranoia to an alarming degree, trying to get her listeners to simply mistrust everything they see and hear except her word. And that, my friends, is the MO of a cult leader, not a thought leader.
Yeah, you got to be just insane to trust the authorities. As soon as somebody says, we're just trusting the authorities, suspect, on the list. What do you mean we're trusting the feds? Like, since when are we doing that? And trusting the feds. Don't question anything. I don't really trust these feds, right? I'm like, no, we don't trust the feds. And since when do we trust the feds? Trust us, we're the feds, bro. We don't trust the feds. I don't trust anybody. I don't trust anything right now. Okay, I trust absolutely nothing. Mia writes, we need truth, and I trust only you right now. Thank you. Aravik writes, you're the only voice I fully trust. Trust me, trust me. Rose writes, no matter what videos I've seen from people on the left or right calling you crazy, I call it fake and gay. You have my full support. Truth is all that matters, and Christ is king. Yeah, here is the thing. People know truth when they hear it, okay? You know truth. You know truth when you see it. I only have a platform because I keep telling the truth, If I had lied, I wouldn't have earned your trust.
For example, she doesn't consistently apply skepticism to all sources of information. Her skepticism is lopsided according to her biases. For instance, her anti-Semitism. She won't accept or even acknowledge the atrocities committed by Palestinians against Jews for years, even before the establishment of Israel, least of all October 7th. But she will gleefully publish every false headline that smears Jews or the state of Israel without question. If the information is anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist in nature, it suddenly becomes undisputed fact, no matter how unreliable the source is. And a lot of information that was pushed out about Israel and the war in Gaza was flat out false. Later retracted, but no one ever talks about the information that's retracted. They only like to amplify the lies. She also tends to blame Jews as a collective anytime a single Jew is involved in anything nefarious. This is called racism. Was there a Jew involved in pornography? That means Jews are behind the porn industry. Was there a Jew who owned a slave? That means Jews are behind the entire slave trade. Don't you know? Was Epstein a Jew? That means Jews are running a massive global pedophile ring. She is deeply loyal to her own narratives, no matter the facts that abound to the contrary of her personally held beliefs. This makes her a propagandist. Another example of her asymmetrical skepticism would be the way she distrusts everything law enforcement has established as fact about Charlie Kirk's murder, but gleefully entertains all unhinged, crowdsourced intel from her followers and her tip line, or the way she questions every aspect of TPUSA's enterprise and their operatives, many of whom were Charlie's closest friends, but willingly trusts and amplifies the word of an apparent con artist who is obviously lying about seeing Erika Kirk at a military base meeting before Charlie's assassination. And oh yeah, who's also apparently convinced that he's the son of the Zodiac killer. And she even raised money to line this Muppet's pockets, almost like, oh, I don't know, she wanted to compensate him for smearing Erika Kirk on her behalf after Erika debunked her lies in that meeting. Seems to me she thought she was being clever by outsourcing her libeling of Charlie's widow to a habitual liar for hire. Essentially, it seems to me that the leading motivation behind Candace's skepticism is to gain control of narratives for self-enrichment. Again, like she did with Charlie Kirk's rather straightforward assassination, because there is money and influence to be gained in convoluting the straightforward, and then pretending to be the only one capable of decoding it. But don't get me wrong, in the sane world of fact-finding, healthy skepticism is an incredibly useful tool. It is indispensable when trying to arrive at the objective truth. We all practiced it when we were trying to determine who was telling the truth in the Blake Lively versus Justin Baldoni ordeal. When applied evenly and in an unbiased manner, skepticism is perfectly acceptable and highly encouraged. Every school of thought operates by epistemic norms or guardrails else, from science to philosophy to theology to historiography and journalism. But I suppose for someone who openly questions well-established scientific facts such as the existence of dinosaurs or whether the earth is round or whether or not we landed on the moon, it should perhaps come as no surprise she has little regard for the rules of critical thinking and sound reasoning. Except it does ultimately beg the question, if no institution is trustworthy, if certain science is not settled, if the rules of critical thinking can be selectively applied according to one's own agendas, upon what authority does Candace even stand to make truth statements? If facts are now defined by what she arbitrarily deems them to be on any given day and can otherwise be distorted at will to support mistruths and propaganda, what exactly is there to help her audience ascertain what is true or false aside from Candace's own word, or worse, her dreams and intuition, which her reporting so heavily relies on?
I rarely have vivid dreams, and I did in fact have a very vivid one over the weekend, and Charlie came to me and he told me that he was betrayed. And I don't know who exactly it is that betrayed him, but I also felt in the dream that it is soon going to be revealed. A dream that I had, a very vivid dream. This one was clear. Charlie told me that he was betrayed. He actually said more than that, actually. It is so deep. It is a knowing. It's not even a feeling. It's a knowing. It's not a dream to me. It's like a prophecy. It's like Charlie was betrayed. I don't know what else to say to you. Today, I feel that it is time to tell you the entirety of the repeat dream that I was having in those early weeks.
So much more to come. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you soon.